The first frost came like a quiet breath, unwelcome, yet not unfamiliar. It whispered over the low hills of the village, settling gently, and then cruelly, into every thatched crevice and barefoot crack. The air stiffened, the sky paled, the world shrank into the shape of a hearth, and the distance between supper and starvation grew thinner than the crust of ice on the water bucket. In these ancient mornings, when time was counted not in hours, but in aches and coals, the peasant body became an instrument of endurance. They did not speak of surviving the winter, they spoke of outlasting it, and every breath was a kind of prayer. Beneath the thinning thatch, the wind found every crack. They stuffed the gaps with rags, with moss, with dung, not out of ignorance, but out of sheer genius necessity. Blankets were a luxury, warmth a borrowed thing, shared by bodies, hoarded like treasure, and never enough. They slept in groups, shoulder against shoulder, child between mother and father, dog curled at feet, chickens in baskets beside the bed. Every warm breath became part of the architecture of hope, every heartbeat a kindling. Fire was everything. It was mother, it was saint, it was God. They did not simply light it, they tended it, fed it with bones, with splinters, with scraps of yesterday's hope. They banked it at night, burying its breath under ash, whispering promises, live until morning, and we shall feed you again. A dead fire meant death, not just from the cold, but from what the cold did to the soul. In the hush before dawn, when the air was thick as wool, and the wind licked like a blade, the oldest of the household rose first. Knees stiff, bones groaning, they reached for the hearth, not to light a fire, but to resurrect it. Under the thick crust of ash, a single ember might glow, a coal no larger than a fingernail. That ember, that stubborn fragment of warmth, was the hinge upon which their morning swung. It was coaxed gently with breath, encouraged with straw, whispered into life like a spell. No one spoke. Words might wake the cold, and then slowly flared, red light on soot-dark walls, cracking sound like bones releasing from ice. The room came back to life, one flicker at a time. This was not comfort, it was survival. The fire was memory of last winter, of the one before that, of the grandmother who had taught them the art of smoke and flame, the rhythms of ash, the patience of heat. The fire kept their ghosts warm, and in return, they kept the fire alive. Hunger was not an event, it was a season, a long, slow season, that arrived not with thunder, but with absence. First the potatoes were gone, then the flour, then the carrots that tasted of damp hope. By late January, the cellars were hollow. What remained was memory and cleverness. They made soup from pebbles, broth from bones that had been boiled before. They scraped mold from cheese, soaked hard bread in water, and called it supper. They chewed slowly, not from etiquette, but to trick the body into believing, had eaten more. Children were taught to drink hot water before sleep, so their bellies would not growl in the dark. Hunger was not a visitor, it was a relative, familiar, unwanted, always sitting at the table. But still, they gave thanks for the crust, for the marrow, for the memory of fat, because the soul, unlike the body, could survive longer on faith. Bread was not food, it was ritual, it was prayer, rising under cloth like a secret. The dough, mixed with last year's flour, or perhaps even barley meant for pigs, was treated as sacred. Hands, rough with frost and toil, shaped it not just into loaves, but into hope. Before baking, they carved crosses into the top, not just for the Savior, but for survival. a silent blessing, request. Let it rise, let it hold, let it feed. The baking of bread was an act of resistance against the empty, took hours, and in that time, the air changed, the hut warmed, the children's eyes brightened, the ghosts grew quiet. When the loaf emerged, dark and cracked and steaming, it was broken with reverence, one slice for each soul. And still someone always gave up their share, usually the oldest, or the mother, because bread was survival, but love was endurance. The sky was not just sky, it was language, and they read it, in stars, in cloud shapes, in the color of the dawn. If the wind shifted before morning, the old women would murmur, snow before the next moon. If the moon glowed red, the shepherds crossed themselves, and when no birds flew, not even the crows, something deep in their bones began to fear. They spoke of signs, they listened for omens, in the creaking trees, and in the moaning of the church rafters. The sky watched them, and they in turn watched it. Prayers were whispered, not just in chapels, but in fields, by empty granaries, at the feet of bare trees. Spare us, O heaven, they prayed. Let the lambs be born whole. Let the frost hold back its bite. Let spring come sooner this year. But no voice ever echoed back, only silence. And yet, still they prayed, not because they believed they'd be answered, but because it was the only warmth they had. When the fire grew cold, wool rough soaked, crusted with weeks of grease and dirt, was still salvation. They layered it in desperation, under layers of linen, stiff and sour, tunics of wool, too worn to be called warm, overcoats, patched and padded with straw, stained from years of winters. They did not wash their clothes often, and not out of sloth, but because cleanliness could be a killer. Wet wool froze, and frozen cloth became iron, so they wore their filth proudly, 'cause it was insulation, a skin of survival. It smelled of smoke, of bodies, of days spent crouched near embers. And the water was a cruel trickster. It fed their animals, but it bit the hands that dipped into it. Washing clothes meant plunging into a stream that numbed the fingers blue. A shirt became a stone in your hands, a sheet a flag of ice. So they adapted. Let the smoke do the cleaning. Let the body adjust to the stink. Let nature know. They would not yield, not to the frost, not to the shame. Because in these winters, even dignity had to wear a second layer. Between the ringing of the church bells was a silence so heavy, could press the breath from your chest. Winter slowed even sound. Footsteps disappeared in snow. The creak of gates was swallowed. Only the bell remained, tolled for death, for Sunday, for warnings, but mostly, it told to remind the living that someone still had the strength to pull the rope. Inside the chapel, prayers hung like fog. Deliver us from this cold, from famine, from fever, from wolves in the woods. They sang with cracked voices, not for joy, but for remembrance, songs from older winters, verses passed down like firelight. The youngest child could recite the Pater Noster before they could count, because God was heat, because heaven in their minds was not gold or harps, but bread, and warmth, and bare feet in a field of grass. The silence between the bells was filled with those dreams, and the belief, however faint, that the snow would end at the farthest corner of the pantry, where mice had gnawed the corners of old sacks, and the frost clung like breath on stone. They found it, the last onion, wrinkled, soft in places, its outer skin like parchment, brown and whisper thin. It was not just food, it was a relic. The onion meant soup, meant flavor. It meant a memory of autumn harvest, when carts overflowed, and laughter wasn't rationed. They passed it around the table, one to another, holding it like a sacrament. No one spoke. The children's eyes were too wide. The mother's face, a mask of quiet math. Who will eat tonight? Who will sleep with only dreams? She peeled it slowly, and even the papery skin crackled like fire. Into the pot it went, not chopped, to stretch its spirit into every sip. The broth would be thin, but it would be warm, and tonight that was enough. The smell filled the hut, like a hymn, and for a moment, they believed in spring, believed in survival, believed that even the smallest gift, when shared, could become a feast. The river, once the vein of the village, had turned to glass, smooth, silent, treacherous. To cross it was to gamble, but the other side meant wood, and wood meant fire, and fire meant life. So they crossed, one by one, holding their breath, listening not to the wind, but to the ice. Creak, a groan, a whisper of doom beneath their feet. They stepped only where old tracks still showed, trusting the wisdom of frozen footprints. Some carried bundles, some dragged sleds. One child walked barefoot, boots tied around his neck. Keep them dry. If the ice broke, there would be no second chance. No one could swim in that water. Bit deep, and held you. The villagers prayed without sound, the kind of prayer spoken through the tightening of shoulders, through the shared glance between mother and son. And when they made it across, they did not cheer, they just kept walking, because the firewood still had to be carried home, and the ice was not finished cracking. The smell of ash clung to everything, air, blankets, bread. It was the scent of winter itself, not the crisp pine of modern tales, but smoke, and char, and soot ground into skin. The hearth was never clean, nor was it meant to be. Ash was a reminder. Something had burned. Something had kept you warm, even if only for an hour. Children played in it. Elders dusted it over wounds. Women used it to wash pots. When soap ran out, it painted the village in gray, but also in survival. And when the winds howled, and the doors shuddered, and the cows moaned in the dark, it was the smell of ash that wrapped them like a second skin, not fragrant, not sweet, but faithful, like a prayer no one remembered learning, and could never forget. She watched the world, through a window gone white with ice. She had buried a husband in winter, a son the year after. Now only the fire knew her name. The glass, so thin it bowed with the wind, gave her little warmth, but it gave her a view. And in the stillness of midwinter, the village moved like a dream. A boy dragging sticks, a girl feeding crows, a dog limping, nosing frozen mud, for something long lost. She spoke to none, but she listened, to the snow falling on roofs, to the creak of rafters, to the silence of survival, and she knew, better than most, that it would not last forever. Neither the cold, nor the loneliness, nor the ache in her bones, that felt like time itself whispering goodbye. The light came back slowly, first as a rumor, a pale stripe across the wall. Before dawn, a gentler breath on the wind. Then the icicles began to weep, weeping as though even they had waited too long. Birds returned in cautious pairs, chirping softly, not songs, but questions. And in the huts, no one cheered, because winter never left with ceremony, faded, like grief, like memory, and yet each extra minute of light felt like a miracle, measured not in hours, but in less darkness. One less candle burned, one less shadow cast. It was not spring, not yet, but it was something, and something, in those days, was everything. They boiled bones, until the marrow gave up its ghost. Broth became their salvation, thin yes, but warm. Bones from old feasts, bones traded for firewood, bones found half buried in the snow. They all found their way into the pot. Few roots, a pinch of salt if any remained, a whisper of herb, dried from last summer, and always hunger watching. The steam rising was its own kind of incense. They sipped it in silence, letting the warmth carry them for another day, another prayer, another sleep, another morning that might come without grief. The earth thawed from beneath, quietly, as though it was listening, checking first if it was safe to return. Under snow, roots stirred, worms shifted, and water, sweet, cold, alive, began to move again. The path turned to mud, boots sank. The air smelled of wet bark, and something older, decay waking into growth. Spring was not a sudden song, it was a long breath, held through months of silence, and now, exhaled. The first lamb was always a sign, white as untouched snow, legs trembling like candle flames. It was life reborn, promise wrapped in wool. The village gathered to see it, not to marvel, but to believe that spring would come, that hunger would pass, that not all things must end in cold. With the melting snow came work. The roof had leaked, the beams had bent, but now there was time to repair. The mending of a roof was also the mending of a mind, stitching together the torn seams of winter. With sweat and straw, each handful of thatch was a declaration. We are not done. We remain. We rebuild. They had no calendar for this day, but they celebrated it all the same. When the ground gave way to mud instead of ice, they danced, filthy, soaked, free. They flung earth like confetti. They shouted songs no one had sung since last thaw. The world was not healed, but it was moving, and in movement, they found joy. The boots were wet for months, but now, they steamed in the sun, leather softening, soles loosening their stiffness. They would not last another year, but they had lasted this one, and that, in itself, was a miracle. It was not the bread, or the warmth, or even the fire, that told them winter was ending. It was a single blade of grass, green, fragile, braver than any of them, reaching for the light, before it was safe, like all life does, like they had done, in the coldest months, quiet, will, and alive. Winter does not end with a trumpet. It retreats on dripping roofs, on the whisper of worms returning to the earth. The first mud is not beautiful. It is thick, rank, filled with the rot of hidden months. But to them, it was salvation made visible. The ground, once hard as iron, now took a footprint again. This meant something. This meant seeds could dream. It meant the frost no longer ruled the bones. Meant future might be possible. They bent to the dirt like it was a child's face, brushing it with care, whispering to it, as if it might remember them, and in a way, did. For months, smoke had smelled of wet moss and desperation, anything that would burn, but now, smelled like trees again, clean, dark, alive. He split logs not for survival, but for comfort, not to stave off death, but to welcome warmth. The fire was no longer an altar of suffering. It was a hearth again. The daughter laughed. The axe struck true. And the chimney told the sky, softly, we are still here. The pot had cracked in December. They thought it was gone, but someone quietly had mended it. A borrowed nail, a strip of copper, the repair held, and now it boiled again. Some things break, but not all things are meant to stay broken. Some hold more meaning after the fracture. 'cause they carried history and heat through the wound, like people. The first flowers of the year do not wait for full sun. They bloom when it is still cold, when the wind bites, when the ground groans. They bloom because they must, and because hope, when buried long enough, bursts upward, without permission. She touched the petal like it might vanish, like a dream, but it was real, and it was hers, and it was the beginning of something green. Spring did not bring everyone back. The snow buried more than ground. Some were lost to fever, some to hunger, some to silence that never lifted. The names were spoken in whispers. The cloaks were folded, the shoes left by the fire. But still, they gathered, to remember, to light a candle, to believe that memory itself could be an act of survival. The stalls were empty at first, but slowly, eggs appeared, then cheese, then cabbage, curled and frostbitten, but edible. Coins clinked again. Stories passed between baskets. Someone played a song, half remembered from the last spring, and someone else danced, without shoes. This was not wealth, but it was a beginning. The first market of the year always felt like resurrection. After the snow, the rain came gently, like a blessing. It soaked the ground, carried the salt of tears, and bathed the thatch. This was no storm, it was a balm. And in its rhythm, they heard forgiveness. The children danced, because the rain no longer meant fear. It meant life was beginning again. He planted beside her grave, not out of sentiment, but necessity. She would have understood. The ground had thawed. The seed could wait no longer. The act of turning earth became its own kind of mourning, and its own kind of prayer. Every furrow a whisper. We go on. We go on. For months, the door had stayed closed, shut against the cold, the wolves, the wind. But now, she left it open, just a crack, letting the air in, letting the sounds return. Birdsong, breeze, and her own heartbeat. The cottage breathed again, and so did she. There was no feast, not in the way the rich might know it. No roast, no abundance, but they gathered anyway. They sang, they gave thanks, for breath, for sun, for one another. The feast was made of survival, and in that silence, they were full. 'Twas round, smooth, still warm from the hen's belly. The first egg of the year. It was not a feast, it was not enough, but it was a sign, a silent, unbreakable promise. Life returns. The child who found it held it close, as though it might disappear. They would not eat it, not yet. First they would show it to the grandmother, then the neighbor, then the priest, 'cause it was sacred. A thing made not of yolk and shell, but of hope and time. And for one moment, that egg felt heavier than the winter itself. With the melting of the snow came the work no one spoke of, the cleaning of the dead. Winter took them gently in their sleep, or suddenly, like a breath stolen in wind. Burials had been hasty, ground frozen, stones uncut. Now came the tenderness, the brushing of names, the resetting of crooked crosses, the lighting of candles. They wept, but not from grief alone, from gratitude, because they had made it through and some had not, and they owed the silence their reverence. The first act of spring was not joy, it was labor, hands to the dirt, back to the wind. They planted because they must, not because it was easy. Each seed placed with ceremony, each furrow a prayer, not for abundance, but for just enough, because they had learned. The land gives, but only when asked with humility. They returned like golden messengers, bees, wings humming against the new air, weaving between blossoms, touching the world awake. The village welcomed them not with nets, but with silence. To kill a bee was to curse the harvest. So they watched and whispered and followed them to hidden places, hollow logs, secret corners where honey waited like treasure. Sweetness after so long felt like a sin, but they ate it slowly like forgiveness. He had vanished into the snow 3 moons ago, with his sheep, with his silence, and now he returned, thinner, weather-beaten, but alive. They gathered to greet him, not with fanfare, but with bread and wine and arms around shoulders. He brought news of storms, of wolves, of stars they'd never seen, and though he said little, his return was a story enough. The water moved again, not as ice but as song, trickled, bubbled, shone, and they welcomed it like an old friend returned from war. The buckets grew heavier, the burdens lighter. They washed their clothes, their hands, their grief, and for the first time in many weeks, they saw their own reflections, and remembered they were still human. It began not with a feast, not with a song, but with a laugh, surprise, as if the mouth had forgotten how to shape joy. But one child laughed, and others followed, and soon the village echoed with the music they thought they had lost forever. It did not fill their bellies, but it fed something deeper. The last frost comes like a farewell kiss, cold, beautiful, and final. It burns the youngest buds, like winter's parting lesson. Remember me, it whispers, and they do. 4 months, they will still listen for its return. But this morning the earth warmed faster, and the frost melted. The table returned to the outdoors, not out of luxury, but of longing. To eat beneath sky, to feel warmth on skin instead of smoke in lungs. They laid out green things, bitter and wild, and smiled anyway, because now the color had come back. The season turned not like a wheel but like a breath, long held, finally released. They did not forget winter, but they no longer feared it, because it had been survived, and in its place life returned, slowly, softly, as it always does. It began not with trumpets, but with a letter. From the English court, gilded and dangerous, came the summons. Place for her. Roll. A whisper beneath the wax seal. Come and rise. She was born not to power, but near enough to feel its heat. The Bullen name held weight, though not quite royal, and was not heir, not noble enough to be secure, not poor enough to be free. But ambition, that she carried like flame. France taught her everything. How to smile with danger, how to dance with intention, how to wield silence like a blade. She returned to England not as the girl who had left, but as a mirror polished, reflecting power itself. The court was a theater, every glance a scene, every dress a dialogue, and Henry, the playwright, and the audience both. And entered, not as a spectator, but as a new kind of heroine. Mary came first, the sweet one, pliable one, Henry's mistress for a moment. But Anne was different, not a mistress, not a shadow, queen or nothing. She said no, to the king, to power handed easily, and in that no she became irresistible. A woman who wanted not just his body, but his crown. He wrote her again and again, as a boy might, as a man undone, calling her his heart's ease, begging, pleading, and she did not reply right away. Catherine had ruled beside him for 20 years. She was queen in title and queen in soul. But time, like a tide, wears down stone, and Henry grew restless. Anne was the storm. Henry wanted a divorce. Rome said no. And so a new church was born, not of faith but of want, and was no longer a mistress. She was doctrine, she was revolution, took years, but at last she was crowned, not beloved, not welcomed, but undeniable, the girl from heaven, now a queen. But the higher the crown, the sharper the fall. She had him, but not all of him. Henry was restless, always seeking, and ever watchful, knew what the court did not say aloud. Queens do not sleep soundly. daughter, Elizabeth, future brilliance, present disappointment. For Henry wanted a son, and gave him a flame, but he only saw shadow. Even as unruled another watched, quiet, obedient, the perfect opposite. Jane Seymour, a whisper growing louder with every sigh from the king. The body failed, or the fear did, or fate. She lost child after child, and each one chipped away at Henry's patience, and at Anne's defenses. His gaze once burned, now it chilled. Once she was all he saw, now she was simply in the way. Whispers began where candles could not reach. Of flirtation, of treason, of lovers imagined or invented. Truth mattered less than the telling, and the walls began to close. The crown wobbled, then fell, and Bullen, once untouchable, was taken, not with swords, but with silence, and a single word, treason. The tower knows grief. It echoes with the final steps of those who once believed they were immortal, and entered quietly, a queen still, but only in name. She denied it all, the lovers, the lies, the betrayal, but truth did not matter. Not when Henry had already looked away. No axe, a sword swift and clean, courtesy, or a final insult. The hour drew near, and Bullen, prepared to meet it with open eyes. Some absences are louder in spring. The chair once creaked when she sat, now it stayed still. The shawl still held her scent, and the fire burned not just for warmth, but for memory. Every survivor carried a silence, and some silences had names. They had lost all but one. Just a single hen who had outlasted the snow. She gave one egg every few days. They didn't eat it. They watched it, revered it. It was the promise of more, of nourishment, of future chicks, of cycles restarting. Hope nestled in a shell. The body remembers, the frostbite, the burns, the lash of wind, but it also heals, slowly, quietly. Like the earth itself, the body forgets just enough to go on. Blisters turned to leather, pain became memory, and memory became strength. After winter, everything needed washing, a soot, a sweat, a sorrow. But water ran again, and hands scrubbed away the season. Each shirt lifted on the line like a flag of survival. Like skin reborn. Even the smallest things, socks, aprons, smocks, declared, "We made it." Life begins at the root. The green came slowly but surely. Soft shoots through black earth like whispers growing into song. Food was still months away. But the sight of it, the color of it, was nourishment. Enough to keep digging. Enough to believe. For a long time, laughter had gone underground. It had curled up in fear, waiting for permission to return. But now a hoop, a dog, a game, and the sound returned, wild, uncontrolled, alive, as if joy itself had survived winter too. Planting season returned like scripture, line by line, row by row. They did not need speeches, they needed seed. And so they worked not with fanfare, but with reverence. Each handful of dirt was a vow. We will not starve next winter, not if we can help it. After winter, they needed more than bread. They needed each other. Stories were told, not for entertainment, but to stitch the past into the present. Who was lost? What was learned? What could change? The tree bloomed above them, and beneath it they bloomed too. Not all healing comes from warmth. Some comes from plants that slept beneath the snow. Leaves with memory, roots that remember sun. She knew what to pick, what to mix, what to whisper over the steam. The child drank, and the ache began to ease. Spring was not just about planting, it was also about restoring the broken. Winter was full of noise, wind, hunger, sobs. But now silence meant peace, the kind where no one shivers, where the fire is steady, where no one has to speak to be safe. The stars looked down and blinked approval, and the night for once asked nothing. The cloak had saved him. Now he saved it. Not everything can be replaced. Some things must be honored with repair. And as she stitched a flower into its corner, she was saying, this too has survived. Not just people, but the things that held them. Candles had been rationed, guarded, prayed over. This one, the last of the winter batch, burned with no urgency. They didn't need it anymore, not like before, so they let it die with dignity, flame to smoke, and smoke to spring. There comes a day when you count the missing, not for grief but for record, to say you mattered, you were here, and even if your voice is gone, your name will remain. Apples don't grow overnight, but he planted it anyway. He might not live to taste its fruit, but his children might. And that was enough. That was everything. A tree is an act of defiance against death. New life stumbles. Sure, fragile, but it rises, because that's what spring is. Not a season, but a rising. Again and again. Winter left them tangled. But now she combed the knots away, one strand at a time. The braid was a ritual, a way of saying we are whole again. Not all love is loud. Some love is quiet like a breath, like a kiss before bed when the worst has passed, when the wolves are gone, when the door no longer creaks with fear. That kiss said, sleep, spring is here. He had leaned on the last one through every blizzard. Now it was time for something new. He shaped it slowly, with memory, with care. It wasn't just a tool. It was a future you could lean on. For the first time in months, they didn't need the fire. The cold no longer clawed. They slept without the crackle, without the smoke. And when they woke, the world was still soft. Winter is a story, so is spring. The bell rang not for death, but for renewal. For those who endured, for those who grew, and for those who will never be forgotten. The bell rang, the earth answered, and so it began again. Every flutter beneath her skin felt like prophecy, for it was not her child alone, it was the realm's future, a prince. And the world would sigh in relief, a girl, and whispers would begin, and felt the court's breath on her belly. An invisible crowd peering into the palace walls, waiting for the cry that would decide her fate. Midwives came with relics and rhymes, physicians with contradictions and cautions, and clever and quiet, simply folded herself into prayer. She knew the danger, not of childbirth, but of disappointment. 4 queens are not mourned if they fail to give kings a crown. September brought the wind. And the child, Elizabeth. The name fell like a golden leaf in autumn. Lovely, but not what was hoped for. The court offered smiles, thin as parchment. The king forced cheer, already looking past her tiny fists toward dreams of a son not yet born. And burned with love. She saw not failure but fire. A daughter who would survive storms, who would learn to walk where men fell. She kissed the child's forehead and whispered not lullabies, but strategy. For the world might not want Elizabeth, but Anne would teach her to take it anyway. Once her footsteps were followed. Once her laughter drew circles of admirers. Now there were pauses in conversation when she entered. Now there were glances exchanged behind hands. Jane Seymour, Bill, Blight. The new stillness that crept into the king's eyes, and saw it all. She, who had outwitted queens and cardinals, now walked among ghosts, people who looked at her and already saw a memory. She still held the crown, but it no longer held her. She was not undone by scandal or sin. She was undone by silence. She wrote him one last letter, not as queen to king, but as woman to man. She reminded him of laughter, of secret glances in corridors, of shared dreams in the garden before the crown. She begged for mercy, not for herself, but for her daughter. The paper carried tears and truth, and the tremble of a heart breaking gently. The letter was sealed and sent, but it was never opened. The king by then had stopped reading anything with her name upon it. May arrived not with flowers but with footsteps. The tower awaited, and did not cry. She walked as one already beyond judgment, past fear, past fury. The women who accompanied her wept behind sleeves, and held her spine straight and her silence holy. She had once made kings kneel. Now she bowed only to history. The chamber was quiet, but not still. Whispers moved like insects. Cold hands folded over parchment, and stood where only men were meant to stand, alone, accused, and luminous. They said she seduced her own brother, that she danced too freely, that her laughter was treasonous. They spoke her name as if it were a curse, or a spell gone wrong. Mirrors behind the bench distorted her face, fractured it, multiplied it, turned her into a myth before her life had even ended. She did not tremble. She did not weep. She let their words fall around her, and stared straight ahead with eyes that remembered every lie ever told by a man with a crown. They came with faces she once knew, men who had toasted her at banquets, danced beside her under candlelight. Now they pointed, not out of conviction, but out of survival. They said she bewitched them, that she had 7 lovers, that she laughed in the king's face. One even claimed she conjured miscarriages with her ambition. Her womb was treason, her wit was danger, her mind a thing best silenced. No proof was needed, only permission, and they had it, from a king who no longer remembered the way her lips once shaped his name like a hymn. It ended not with thunder, but with ink, a line drawn beneath her name, and that was all, and stood while her sentence was read. She did not interrupt. She allowed the silence to speak for her, louder than any plea, fiercer than any cry. For she had spoken for years. She had spoken in court, in council, in bed, in pain. And now she chose quiet, because sometimes silence is the last form of power. That night she prayed, not for life, but for clarity. She asked that her daughter remember only her strength, not her fall. She forgave those who betrayed her, not because they deserved it, but because she needed the weight gone before she crossed the final threshold. The air was cold in the tower, but she found warmth in memory, in faith, in the softness of knowing she had once held history in her arms. She slept briefly, and dreamed of a crown, not on her head but on her daughter's. They brought the sword from Calais, French, precise, whiff, and had requested it herself. Even in death she chose grace. The man who would end her bowed before her, as if to a queen, and she smiled. She knelt upon the straw, tucked her dress beneath her knees, and spoke her last words not to the crowd, but to the wind. To Jesus Christ I commend my soul. Lord, receive my spirit. And then a breath, and then no more. People did not cheer. They watched silent, as though some invisible thread had snapped inside the world. The wind rose as if in mourning. It took her name and scattered it into the bells, the cobblestones, the Thames. Her blood was quickly cleared, but her absence remained, sharper than any sword. In the tower, the ravens stayed quiet for 3 days. Some said they, too, knew that something sacred had been severed. The throne did not stay empty. Never does. Jane Seymour walked carefully through the corridors where and once reigned. She wore the crown lightly, as if afraid it might burn her. And perhaps it did. For no woman ever sat there again without wondering, what did it cost her? Elizabeth was too young to know what her mother had been. But she felt it, in the silences, in the sideways glances, in the gaps in her story. At night she watched the stars, not for answers, but for echoes. Years passed, and Elizabeth walked the same halls. People whispered she had her mother's eyes, her cleverness, her fire. She never spoke Anne's name aloud, but sometimes she paused in the gallery, listening, as if memory lived in the fabric of the walls. She never knew the touch, but she knew the legend. And sometimes, in quiet hours, Elizabeth held her mother's portrait like a relic, a woman erased who still shaped everything. They said she was too weak, too young, a girl. But when Elizabeth spoke, the earth tilted, and had died for a crown. Her daughter would wear it like armor. They saw her mother in her, not in smiles but in storms. Anne's voice, though long silent, spoke through Elizabeth's every decree. Anne's story had been written in blood. Elizabeth's would be penned in gold. Mother and daughter, one buried beneath stone, one crowned in the stars. The tower forgets many, but not Anne. Her name, once whispered in fear, now hangs in the air, a ghost that never stopped walking. The daughter became the queen, and the queen became a legend. But behind every title, every triumph, was the fire of a woman who dared to rise too soon, and burned so her child could shine. In the hollow hours of night, when no footsteps echo and the world holds its breath, and sits still beneath stone and shadow, with nothing left but the weight of breath, he does not sleep. Sleep belongs to the living, and she has begun to drift beyond that shore. She writes, though the ink bleeds and the words shake, a letter to her daughter, a whisper for Elizabeth, too young to understand, too royal to forget. What can a mother leave behind when the crown was made of thorns, and the lullaby ends with steel? She writes not of blame, not of Henry, not of Rome, but of fire. You are flame, she writes. You are born from a woman who did not kneel. The candle burns low, her quill stills, and the moon outside the bars casts no warmth at all. The day arrives not with thunder, but with a grey whisper. London does not wake for queens, merely watches. The scaffold was simple, a stage made of wood and waiting. Around it stood the audience of history, some curious, some mournful, some just present, but none of them dared blink, and walked to her end without stumbling. No chains, no cries, only the soft breath of fabric against her skin as she lifted her chin toward the sky. She wore grey damask, unjeweled, but her dignity outshone any crown. Her voice was soft, but it reached every ear. I die the king's faithful servant, but God's first. She did not curse, did not accuse. Her silence was her defiance, her grace the sword she could still wield. And as she knelt upon the straw, the hush of the morning settled like a shroud. 1,000 thoughts might have rushed through her mind. Elizabeth's curls, the French courts of youth, Henry's letters, his trembling declarations, the promises broken, the children lost, but none showed on her face, just stillness, and the quiet surrender of breath. There was no scream, no sound but the soft glide of the French blade, the tool chosen for its speed, its elegance, its absence of brutality. But death, no matter how swift, is still death. And Boleyn fell not like a traitor, but like a woman betrayed by history itself. The blade met flesh, and in a single moment, the daughter of ambition, the queen of defiance, the flame in Henry's heart, was gone. Only the echo remained, a soft gasp from the crowd, a ripple in the fog, and the legacy that had only just begun to take shape. She was buried quickly, with no grand funeral, no royal procession. A queen, laid to rest in a grave unworthy of her name. No crown, no choir, just stone, time. But history does not forget fire, not truly. And Anne's name, whispered in darkness, began to glow in centuries to come. Elizabeth, the child of controversy, born of scandal, raised in shadow. But she bore her mother's eyes, dark, knowing, and somewhere in her memory lived the echo of that final letter. You are flame, a spark planted deep in the cold ashes of exile. One day the world would kneel before her, but for now she simply waited as queens in waiting must. Henry remarried barely days after Anne's death. A new queen, a new start. But his eyes never quite found peace again. Love once burned, leaves scars even kings cannot name, and haunted the silence, in the laughter that faded too quickly, in the shadows of the court, in the eyes of a daughter who resembled too much the ghost he tried to bury. Centuries passed, names blurred, thrones fell, and still, the name and Bullen whispered through the halls of memory. She had lived only briefly as queen, but eternally as warning, as symbol, as myth, the flame that burned too bright, and was extinguished too soon. Anne's greatest revenge came not with fire, but with triumph. Elizabeth rose not from nobility, but from scandal, from the ashes of a queen executed by her own king. And yet, she ruled longer than any before her, unmarried, unyielding, a queen made not of gold, but of iron. They tried to erase her. They tried to silence her name. But Anne Boleyn lives, not in tragedy alone, but in the voice of every woman who dares to stand, to speak, to demand her place at the table. She lives in the pages of books, in whispered ballads, in the fierce eyes of daughters. She was flame, and though she burned, her light remains. She did not chase the crown. She merely stood still, and let it fall into her lap. Her symbol had been the falcon, elegant, deadly, royal. But even falcons, once hooded, can forget the sky, and felt the noose tightening. Not a rope, but a silence, fewer allies, more formalities, the king more distant, the queen once unstoppable, now walked with caution. Even the falcon on her glove would not look her in the eye. Supper, music, and murmurs. Thomas Cromwell, the king's architect of policy, began to murmur, and once his ally had become an obstacle. She argued, he challenged, she blocked foreign plans, and worse still, she had failed to produce a son. Cromwell did not need the king's command, only his silence. And at supper, as laughter floated over gold platters, the first threads of betrayal were woven in candlelight. Adultery, incest, treason, one name at first, then two, then six. Musicians, poets, noblemen, anyone who had once smiled too long in Anne's presence. The charges multiplied like mold, and the queen's name was whispered, not in reverence, but as a warning. The court did not gasp, nodded, for many had waited for this storm, and now that it had come, few wanted to be caught standing beside her. May 1536. The queen was arrested. No sword drawn, no resistance, only shock and silence. They came for her during daylight, not in secret, and she walked through the palace like a ghost, her steps echoing against walls that had once sung her name. She asked one thing, why? But the answer was already written, in politics, in power, in the eyes of a king who had already turned away. She had entered the tower once, for her coronation procession. Now she entered again, but this gate was different. The traitor's gate opened like a jaw, and the queen stepped through. Some wept, and watched, but Anne did not cry. She lifted her chin to the sky, and the raven turned its head. The tower stones, ancient and pitiless, prepared to hold her secrets one last time. The hall smelled of old wood and breath. Her trial was not justice, but theater. The verdict had already been carved into the silence of the king's court, and defended herself with grace, with brilliance, with truth. But truth did not belong here, had no crown, no power, no voice. When the sentence came, she bowed her head, not to guilt, but to fate. In the tower, the queen became a woman again. No ladies, no pearls, no court, only stone, and sky, and God, and wept, then prayed, then waited. The hours slowed, the air thickened, and still she held to one thing, not hope, but dignity. The dignity of having once risen, like fire in a kingdom of frost. Before and there was another queen, Catherine of Aragon, daughter of Isabella, widow of a prince, queen by 20 years and mother of only grief. The court had whispered of her strength for decades, but strength is not always loud. Hers was the quiet endurance of a woman who lost child after child to cold cradles, whose womb had been a battlefield of prayers, and now she stood, or rather sat, beneath the royal canopy. Alone, the Spanish queen had become a relic of her own reign. Henry's eyes had turned elsewhere, Anne's laughter echoed in his chambers. Yet Catherine did not yield. She spoke of God. She spoke of law. She named herself queen, still and forever. And when the question of annulment reached Rome, it was not only kings who stood trial, but time itself and may have risen. But Catherine's shadow still hung long across the marble floors, in every chapel where she once knelt, in every corner of court where loyalty still dared breathe her name. She remained not forgotten, not gone, but fading, like a winter that refuses to end. Even as new spring tries to bloom, the court was a stage, and everyone wore a mask, silk smiles, velvet betrayal. Feathers to hide fear there, beneath candlelight and courtly steps, ambition danced in circles and stood apart, watching, calculating, shaping her future not through spells, but through wit. Her mask hung at her side, for she had no need to hide. The others whispered that she bewitched him, that she had French charms, that her eyes could stir tempests. But it was not magic that moved the king. It was challenge, where Catherine obeyed, and defied, where others curtsied, and conversed. She did not flatter. She provoked. She was the question Henry had never dared ask. What if power wore pearls? In this court of masks, where secrets grew faster than roses, and Bullen did not hide. She played the game, not with smiles, but with fire words, ink and breath combined, before and wore a crown. She wore Henry's words against her skin, letters, dripping with longing, heavy with promise. My heart is yours. I long to kiss your pretty duckies. A king reduced to rhyme, and a time when women were bartered for treaty and title, and was being courted through parchment. And each seal broken meant a step closer to the throne, but parchment burns. And love set in ink is still fragile, when power is the true lover in the room. Once, Cardinal Wolsey ruled behind the throne. Now, he was cast aside, not for a failure of state, but for failing to dissolve a marriage. The Pope hesitated. Catherine defied. And Anne, and waited. Wolsey, architect of so much Tudor glory, crumbled beneath the weight of one woman's ambition and another's refusal to fade. He fell not by sword, but by silence and slow exile, even before her coronation, and had claimed her first victory. And the court began to understand. This was not a mistress to be cast aside. She was rising like a storm. What love could not secure, law would be bent to give. Rome said no, Henry said. Then I am Rome, a king untethered from the Pope, from centuries of obedience. Anne stood at the center of the storm. The Church of England was born, not in revelation, but in desire. Priests turned their robes, Parliament turned its back, and an entire realm shifted its soul for the promise of one woman's womb. And was no longer the other woman. She was England's queen in waiting, standing on the bones of faith. And then, at last, the crown, not borrowed, not promised, hers. And was crowned with St. Edward's crown, the first queen consort to do so in full splendor. A woman not of royal blood now sat beside a throne carved for kings. The coronation was spectacle and silence. Bells rang for joy. But in alleys, the people muttered, she had climbed not by grace, but through fire. And even as the crown touched her brow, the weight of it whispered, this is only the beginning. For the higher one rises in Henry's court, the colder the wind becomes. Not a sun, but a star. Elizabeth. Red hair, sharp eyes. A future no one yet dared dream, and had done what many feared she could not. She gave birth. But the child was not the hoped-for prince. Henry smiled, thin. The court clapped, softly. Anne held her child like a blade, daring anyone to question her triumph. For she knew, She knew history had not yet caught up the girl in the cradle, would one day rule empires. But for now, the whispers grew louder, another child, another chance gone. The miscarriage tore more than her body. It cracked the glass between hope and survival. Henry did not come to weep. He came to wait for news of a son. And when the news was sorrow, he turned his back, not out of cruelty, but calculation, and had once been his rising sun. Now she was shadowed by disappointment, and shadow in Tudor courts meant danger. Love in Henry's heart was never still. Like the wind, it changed its direction with the season. Now Jane Seymour's name crept into his dreams. She was soft, she was silent, she did not provoke, and was everything but. The king's gaze began to drift. His hand, once devoted, now hesitated, and felt the frost before the first snow ever touched the ground. Queens are rarely alone, and yet was. The court that once buzzed in her presence now buzzed against her. Smiles thinned, loyalty thinned, and even her own ladies held their breath when she entered. She had risen through daring, but stayed through grace, and grace was bleeding away, drop by drop. In the garden she prayed, not for power, but for time. Time to heal, time to bear again, time to be loved, before the tide turned forever. And in the shadow of a queen, another woman waited, Jane Seymour, no seductress, no flame, a whisper where and was a trumpet. Her silence was her armor, her humility her veil. But Henry's heart, ever restless, sought peace in her stillness. He began to visit more often, to speak more softly, to ask less of and more of Jane. And Jane, the queen, wrote one last letter, words folded in ink and hope, to her daughter Elizabeth, the child she would never see again. She wrote not of fear, but of love, of courage, and of a mother's fierce pride. The quill trembled in the candlelight, a fragile lifeline between the tower walls and the world outside. Her final message: remember me not as the fallen, but as the mother of a queen. And with that, Anne's heart beat steady against the approaching silence. The final night stretched long, and lay awake, feeling time drip like cold water. The stones whispered stories of queens and prisoners, of glory and grief. She held no delusions, but neither did she surrender. When sleep finally came, it was not peace, but the stillness before the storm. Dawn brought the executioner, a man cloaked in shadow, his face hidden. His duty was not mercy, but finality, and met him with steady eyes, her heart pounding not with fear, but with the dignity of the condemned. The crowd gathered, silent and tense. For Queen, this was the coldest stage of all. She walked slowly, each step a prayer, each breath a farewell. The world watched in silence, some with pity, others with judgment. But Anne's gaze was fixed beyond the crowd, beyond the tower walls. She walked not as a prisoner, but as a queen who had held her crown long enough to know its cost. The blade fell swiftly, a final silence, and then peace. Anne's voice was gone, but her story was not. The queen who dared defy kings, who shaped nations, who bore a daughter destined for greatness, was no longer in the flesh, but she lived on, in whispers, in legends, in the blood of queens to come. The court went quiet. A queen was dead, but history never sleeps. The echoes of Anne's life rippled through halls and hearts alike. Some mourned, some rejoiced, and some whispered her name with newfound reverence. For in death, Anne had become legend, a woman who stood tall, even when the world bowed her low. And from the ashes, a new dawn. Elizabeth, daughter of an heir to a kingdom's future. She would remember not only the crown, but the woman who bore it first. In her heart, she carried her mother's fire, a light that would guide England through its darkest hours and into golden age. The court wore its grief like a heavy cloak. Not all hearts were broken, but none remained untouched. Anne's death rippled like a stone cast into still water, unsettling loyalties, stirring whispered regrets. Some saw a martyr, others a cautionary tale. Yet beneath the polished stones and silent walls, a truth lingered, that power comes not only with crowns, but with sacrifice. With and gone the kingdom shifted, alliances realigned, promises once spoken were quietly rewritten. Henry's court, ever restless, looked toward a new horizon, but the break with Rome, the flame and had ignited, could not be easily extinguished. England was changed, forever marked by a queen who dared to rewrite destiny. Elizabeth grew, guarded, watched, taught. She inherited not just her mother's blood, but her strength, her wit, her fierce independence. The daughter of a fallen queen, she learned the rules, only to bend them when needed. In her youth, the shadow of Anne was long, but it was also a shield. Anne's legacy was not carved only in stone or scroll, but in spirit, in the pulse of England's heart, in the breath of its people. Though silenced, her story whispered through time, echoing in the halls of power, in the songs of minstrels, in the pages of history yet to be written. A reminder that even the brightest flames may be snuffed out, but their warmth lingers still. As seasons turned, so did the tides of power. The river of England flowed forward, carrying with it the hopes and fears of a nation. The ripples of Anne's life reached distant shores, unseen yet undeniable, and in the silence between waves, the future whispered, reflection is both gift and curse. Elizabeth looked into glass, and saw not only herself, but the ghosts of those who came before. Her mother's strength, her father's ambition, the fragile hope of a kingdom. The mirror held many truths, and the young queen would learn to see them all, with eyes unflinching and heart unyielding. Power is a weight, presses down, even on those who seem born to bear it. And knew this, Elizabeth would learn it. The crown, beautiful and cold, demands sacrifice, and sometimes the greatest act of strength is to wear it alone. The flame and lit has not died. It flickers still, in every story told, in every crown passed, in every heart that dares to dream. She was more than a queen, she was a spark, and sparks, no matter how small, can set the world alight. From the courts of England to the ancient valleys of Peru, the story of human spirit unfolds, in resilience, in ambition, in innovation, and in the quiet, enduring hope, that no matter the darkness, light will always return. Now we turn to a civilization lost in time, a city where peace was power, and harmony built pyramids. The wind carries many things, sand sent pollen, but once here it carried song. Hollow reeds, carved with care, held the voice of the ancients. They did not play music to perform, they played to belong, to the breath of the valley, to the hush of the stars. Some flutes were made of condor bone, others reeds from the riverbed, but all spoke the same language, longing, joy, remembrance. A child might hum the same tune his grandmother played, not knowing where it began, only that it never ended. The music had no lyrics, but it had memory, memory of firelit gatherings, of spiral dances, of the soft footfall of peace. And though the players have vanished, the air still remembers the shape of their sound. In carol, silence is not absence, it is waiting, and if you listen, you may still hear the echo of a reed flute dancing with the wind. The people of carol spoke in spirals, not with mouths, but with hands. Stone sky. The spiral meant more than design. It was the path of water, the curl of smoke, the unfolding of a fern. In the spiral they saw time, not as a line, but as a return, cycle, promise. It marked their temples, their art, their dances. It marked their lives. And in this spiral, we find a wisdom ancient and unfamiliar, that life is not for racing toward ends, but for circling into understanding. To the west of carol, the sea sings in a different tongue, and the people answered. They built boats from reeds, lie fast alive. They cast nets that danced with silver fish. The desert gave them sun, the ocean gave them salt. Together these two extremes, dry and wet, hot and cold, became one song of survival. They knew that nature was not gentle, but it was generous. Few listened, and so they lived, where few dared to dwell, between waves and wind, carving life out of absence. The greatest mystery of carol is not what was found, but what was not. No arrowheads, no spears, no walls meant to keep others out, no graves of warlords, no statues of conquerors. Instead, there were flutes, there were trade routes, there were seeds, and maybe, just maybe, that is the loudest thing carol ever said, that you can build greatness without blood. The pyramid at carol is not like the others, does not shout its power, does not demand awe. Breathe. It sits with the earth, not above it. It faces the wind, but does not fight it. It is less a monument, and more a meditation, a stillness made from stone, a mountain-shaped breath. In the valley of time, who built carol? Not slaves, not soldiers, but hands in harmony. They wrapped stones in baskets. They moved with chant and breath. No one forced them. The building was not punishment. It was prayer. Every stone set was a line in a poem, a whisper to the gods. We are here. We understand. We belong. They were not building to impress, but to become. No scrolls, no parchment. And yet, they remembered. They tied their knowledge into knots. Tipu, a memory you could touch. String a path. Not a moment. And when they untied it, they remembered not just numbers, but lives. Carol spoke, not with letters, but with rhythm, repetition, and trust. The dust does not forget. Waits for hands, for eyes, for hearts that will listen. Beneath every grain, story sleeps, and when we unearth it, we do not awaken the past. We awaken ourselves. The past is not gone. It walks beside us. Children play near the ruins. Farmers plant cotton still. The bones of the city breathe again. We name this time progress. But carol reminds us, there was wisdom before there was steel. There was peace before there were palaces. We are not the pinnacle. We are the continuation. The wind still moves here. The stones still stand. And though the people are gone, their breath is not. Carol does not cry out. It whispers. And this is what it says. You can build without war. You can thrive without dominance. You can live in tune with sky, soil, and spirit. And when the world forgets, we, the wind and the dust, will remind you. It rose, not in defiance of heaven, but in conversation with it. The pyramid of carol, an earthen hymn laid in tears of memory, smoothed by hand, by breath, by dust carried on wind from sea to mountain. Every stone was a syllable, every layer a prayer. It reached upward not to conquer the sky, but to echo it. And the people gathered at its base, not to kneel before rulers, but to rise toward rhythm. Voices lifted, flutes sang, smoke curled like the dreams of sleeping ancestors. In this place, nothing was ruled, only remembered. The first music here was not a drumbeat of war, but a breath, a long, slow exhale, hollowed through bone and filled with wind. A flute made not for armies, but for spirits. It did not shout, it whispered. Notes curved through the valley like forgotten rivers, weaving harmony into silence. These were songs for the stars, meant not to entertain, but to align. A flute in carol was a compass, and every note was a step into the sacred. They wove, not just garments but continuity. With fingertips and patience, they unraveled the whisper of clouds and turned it into cloth. Cotton, gathered from the desert's edge, was spun with the rhythm of heartbeats. When they wove, they sang, not of war, but of rivers and rain. Their fabrics were maps, prayers coded in thread. These unnamed women were the quiet architects of legacy. In the soft white of salt and the curve of ocean shells, a secret flowed, the secret of peace. Carol thrived not on conquest, but on exchange. The coast sent fish, wrapped in reed baskets, and inland gave cotton, fruit, music, and meaning. There were no walls, no swords, only sandals and shared reverence. For every grain of salt given, something sacred was restored. Listen, can you hear them? The echo of bare feet on clay. Not soldiers, just people walking from hearth to flute, from silence into ceremony. Each path worn by rhythm, not war. Every journey here was toward someone, not away. Beneath sand and time, their footsteps curl around the roots of who we are. They built no roofs where gods needed breath. In the temple of wind, silence spoke louder than prayer. The breeze carried messages, and openings let memory pass. They sat in stillness and listened, not with ears but with their whole lives. The divine did not shout, it rustled. What is a wall when it does not divide? In carol, walls guided, never guarded. They curved around space to invite, not exclude. They held dance, gathered sound, softened the path of prayer. A sacred city was one shared. These hands were not trained to kill. They were trained to make, to smooth, to stir, to mend. Hands that held no weapons because they held each other. In their touch there was no dominion, only continuity. The river did not die. It changed its song. Water wandered, rains paused. The people did not curse the sky. They honored what was and moved. The city did not fall. It whispered goodbye like a lullaby's end. And still, if you listen, truly listen, you will hear it. A sound older than empire, softer than stone. They are still singing, in wind, in cotton, in the silence between stars. The people of carol, children of peace, remember us. Even when before the ink of history, before the drumbeat of empire, there was silence. Not the silence of nothingness, but the deep, humming quiet of ancient earth breathing in wind and stone. In the cradle of time, high upon the desert's bones, rose a city without a name, Carol. Built not on war, but on wind, rhythm, and song. Stones remember. Even when lips forget and tongues grow still, stones hold stories, buried beneath centuries of silence. Carol's walls rise not in triumph, but in reverence. Each step, each terrace, was laid by hands that honored balance. Balance between earth and sky, between human and cosmos. The Soup River, gentle vein of the valley, breathed life into dust. No empire rose here from conquest. No kingdom thundered with war horses. Carol rose like a melody, from water, wind, and will. The people did not conquer the land. They listened to it. No chisel cut this stone. No bronze bore its weight. The builders of Carol used only reed, rope, and hand, yet raised structures that danced with the sun. Pyramids not of power, but of purpose. Not fortresses, but sanctuaries. Theirs was an architecture of harmony. No weapons found. No walls of defense. For nearly 1,000 years, Carol flourished without bloodshed. while others carved victory in steel. The carol carved futures in clay and song. They built not out of fear, but out of vision. Here music was more than celebration. It was memory. It was instruction. It was blueprint. The panpipe, not a child's toy but a sacred thread. Across plazas and through ritual firelight, music bound the people in rhythm with the cosmos. 6 great pyramids rose from the valley floor, aligned with sun and shadow, with solstice and silence. Their arrangement whispered of intelligence deep as the stars. This was not chance. This was design. A city built not to dominate, but to harmonize. Their tools were humble, reeds, ropes, stone, but their knowledge profound. These builders understood the trembling heart of the earth. In reed and sand, they wove resilience. Their buildings flexed with the ground, not against it. A lesson modern towers still forget. Peace gave birth to plenty. In the market square, fish from the coast met cotton from the highlands. Traders spoke in tongues both ancient and joyful. No gold changed hands, only trust. In a world yet unborn, carol was already ancient and already wise. The wind still sings in carol. It moves through broken stones, through silent plazas, through pyramids kissed by time. If you listen, truly listen, you might hear them, voices not lost, only waiting. In the heart of every pyramid, not a throne, not a tomb, but a fire. Sacred flames licked the cold desert air. They offered warmth, but more than warmth. They were bridges between this world and the next, between man and the breathing silence of the stars. They had no metal, no compass, no telescope, but they had the sky. They traced time through starlight. They marked solstices not on paper, but in stone. The cosmos was not something to be measured, but remembered. Under desert stars, they became the first astronomers of the Americas. They gathered in circles, not for judgment, not for spectacle, but to share rhythm. Story, song, and smoke wound around the wind. In the amphitheater, the people became one breath, a spiral of unity, humming with the memory of creation. The future sat barefoot in the dust. Wide-eyed children learning the weave of cotton, the pattern of stars, the shape of songs. They were not molded by war, but by wonder, raised by stories, carried by rhythm, rooted in earth. The children of carol were seeds of something the world would almost forget. Cotton, soft as cloud, strong as wind. It was carol's gold. From this fiber they wove connection. Coastal fishermen traded nets. Mountain dwellers brought herbs. Carol stitched together ecosystems, not with empire but with thread. Their gods had no faces, no swords, no thunder. They worshipped through giving, not demanding. Fruits, feathers, smoke, and grain were laid not in fear, but in gratitude. Theirs was a temple of offering, not of obedience. They gave back because they belonged. No armies marched these roads. No kings held scepters. In 1,000 years, no war scarred these sands. They proved what others forgot, that a city can rise not through conquest, but through cooperation. Carol was a miracle, civilization without blood. But the earth is never still. Winds shift, rivers wander. A drought came not sudden, but creeping. Fields cracked, markets quieted, and Carol listened as it always had. Left, stayed. The song grew quiet, not ended, only fading. No walls fell, no invaders came. The fire simply wasn't lit again. And so the city slept, beneath sand, beneath silence, beneath the weight of forgetting. But the stones remembered. Millennia passed. The world spun and forgot, until one day the sand parted, and Carol whispered again, to hands that would listen. The city woke not with thunder, but with breath, as if to say, we are still here. You are still us. Morning unfolds like a whispered secret, a breath that stirs the sleeping stones of Carol. The sun's first light caresses the ancient city, awakening both shadow and memory. In this place where earth meets sky, time moves like the steady pulse of a heart beneath the dust. These hands, worn, patient, built not only for their time, but for futures yet unborn. In woven reeds and molded earth, they left hope. Ceremonies echoed through the plazas, living dialogues of drumbeats, flutes, and footsteps, binding earth and spirit. The river flowed like a pulse, a teacher and friend, its song guiding the rhythms of life. Carol was built on balance. Terraces held hills, canals kissed fields, pyramids reached sky in harmony, not conquest. Stones whispered silent stories, their texture speaking of dreams laid down like bricks. A flute's song, carved from bone, still drifts through the valley, music as memory. The ancestors breathed through firelight and ritual, their legacy etched in the sacred silence of stone. The wind whispers still, carrying Carol's secrets for those who pause to hear. A flame atop an altar glows, memory made fire. Carol's legacy is peace, found in laughter, in sharing, in the sacredness of life. Light and shadow dance across its walls, teaching us balance. From the valley's bloom to woven threads, renewal and time weave through us. Harmony is a heartbeat, heard in communal gatherings and deep listening. The breath of tomorrow is shaped by the choices of today. A child's flute echoes into dusk. Carol's song never ends. Beneath a tree, silence teaches the gift of listening. A lantern's glow becomes understanding, guiding us toward peace. The earth sings with wildflowers and bees. Carol listens, and so must we. Connection is breath shared. Time dances in sun and moonlight. Hope sprouts even through cracked earth. Peace is light, steady and guiding. The flame burns on. Tomorrow looks out across the valley through a child's eyes. And as stars blanket the sky, Carol's song lives on, an eternal melody of peace, resilience and hope. After centuries of silence, stone awakens beneath gentle hands, whispers of a forgotten city stirred by the breath of discovery. Here, history unfolds not as conquest or destruction, but as soft remembrance, a memory carved in earth and time. The stones speak in riddles, their language poetry of endurance, inviting us to understand how to live in harmony, to build without tearing down, to thrive without ruling over others. The threads spun here are lifelines, connecting ancient hands to ours across millennia, each weave carrying stories of resilience, patient creation, and beauty born from necessity. Earth, wind, fire, and water dance in sacred rhythm. Carol's people moved not against but with this dance, honoring every element with humble steps. In stillness, voices linger, words we may never fully grasp, yet their resonance endures, teaching that silence holds as much power as sound. Carol was a civilization without kings or walls of power, thriving instead on equality, shared purpose, and community as a living organism where every voice and breath counted. And then, as all things must, Carol slipped into a sacred silence. Not absence, but pause, a moment for reflection and honoring what was. Rediscovery brings a gift, a bridge between past and present, as dust is brushed away and stones speak anew of hope and dreams of peace carried forward, fragile yet unbroken. The dust teaches humility, that greatness lies not in swords or crowns, but in care for earth and community, reminding us civilization is a circle in which all life belongs. The wind never stops moving. It carries stories, seeds, and songs, reminding us time flows not just forward but around us. The future is shaped by the same breath that shaped Carol's stones, with care, respect, and hope. Carol is more than an ancient city. It is an eternal idea, a testament to what humanity builds when choosing peace over power, harmony over dominance, remembrance over forgetting. Beneath our feet, the earth pulses with quiet heartbeat, a language of roots and balance that Carol's people understood with reverence, building upon life itself. Water is memory. The canals that lace Carol's fields were veins carrying lifeblood and stories, a promise between people and land to nourish gently. Above Carol, stars were guides and markers for time, season, and spirit. The cosmos was a map of meaning, reflecting earthly order and swirling harmony. Community was breath, the sacred inhale and exhale weaving individuals into a living tapestry of shared food, stories, and music. The silent architects of Carol shaped vessels for remembrance, every stone set with intention and humility, teaching the power of creation rooted in patience. Ancestors whisper through leaves, bones, and wind. Carol's people built to listen, remember, and honor what came before. Life transformed, not lost. Peace does not roar. It is the soft echo lingering after the storm, the calm water reflecting sky. Carol's terraces rise without ramparts, homes built without fear, standing as a testament to a civilization thriving without violence, calling us always to choose peace. Time is a tide rising and falling, shaping memory's sands. Carol was born and faded in tides, yet its spirit returns, carrying lessons of beginnings, endings, and moments between. Light fills the valley at dawn, touching stone and soil, waking dreams and memories. Hope that even after silence, illumination and new beginnings are possible. Carol's greatest gift is not stones or relics, but the reminder that humanity's true strength lies in harmony, listening, patience, and peace. Through us Carol lives, walls but sky, not spears, but the quiet guidance of starlight. One day they began to leave, slowly, without violence, without fire or blood, just absence. The plazas fell quiet, the flutes stopped, and the wind reclaimed the stairs. Why they left, none can say with certainty. Was it the river's changing song? A shift in trade, a whisper of new lands? The city, once so full of breath, inhaled deeply and exhaled, and was gone, not broken, not erased, simply returned to the wind. They did not vanish in a day. Their departure was not like the crash of thunder. It was more like the receding tide. One basket left behind, one hut swept by wind, then another day with fewer voices, then silence. The people of Carol, who once sang with flutes and built with patience, began to walk away. Some say the river changed course, that the water no longer came like it used to, that the valley, once so generous, tightened its grip on life. Others whisper of migrations, peaceful diffusion into other valleys, like seeds caught on the air. But the earth, when asked, gives no answer, only footprints in stone dust. And wind, endless wind. In the quiet you can almost hear it. Note, breath, tone barely remembered. Perhaps the last to echo across the great plaza. Was it a song of farewell? A ritual for departure? Or merely a child's lonely tune, echoing into empty corridors? In Carol, music was never just sound. It was structure, a way of knowing when to gather, when to plant, when to pause. And perhaps it was the song itself, the breaking of that sacred rhythm, that marked the city's end. Not a war, not a fire, but a silence where once there was harmony. And still, the melody drifts, half lost, half hoped. A final note cradled in the breath of the hills. What becomes of sacred stone when the hands that shaped it vanish? Does not cry out, simply waits. The great pyramids of Carol, once alive with footfall, now spoke only to the sun. Their symmetry faded under time's breath, but their purpose endured. Though no rituals stirred their platforms, the stones held memory, not in words but in weight. In angle, in how they cast shadow. They had been lifted not by ambition, but by communion. And so even as Carol emptied, its stone bones remained, quiet witnesses, humming to the wind. There are no grand tombs in Carol, no pyramids for kings, no stone coffins sealed in gold. The dead here did not demand monuments. Instead, they returned to the soil that fed them, wrapped in reeds, cradled in silence. In Carol, burial was not about triumph. It was about return. Death was not an ending, but a folding back into the song of the land. Their graves were the valley itself. Their names were held by memory, not chisel. And when we search for them now, it is not in tombs, but in wind and pollen and shadow. Centuries passed. The desert grew taller. The stories sank beneath dust. And Carol, the mother of cities, was forgotten. The wind knew her, but the world did not. Her elders had become ash, her knowledge scattered in clay and flute, in alignment and absence. Yet nothing truly disappears. The dust itself held memory, pressed between stone and silence. The wisdom of the people settled into the land like seed, waiting for the right hands to lift it again. And then hands returned, not to conquer but to listen, to brush gently the veil of centuries. The rediscoverers came not with swords, but with notebooks. They came with questions, with reverence, with awe. And Carol, patient, sleeping Carol, began to answer. Her stones aligned once more with thought. Her plazas opened their secrets. The silence was not broken. It was translated. We speak of ruins as endings, but ruins speak back, if we listen. Carol whispers not of defeat, but of choice. A society that chose balance over battle. That raised pyramids not in honor of gods of war, but for gatherings, for music, for learning the stars. And so the wind carries her message, soft but enduring, that peace is not weakness, that silence is not absence, that the greatest strength may lie in not shouting at all. The children return, not the same but connected, descendants not by blood, but by curiosity. They walk where music once lived. They ask questions in a language Carol never knew. But the stones understand. They feel the footsteps, soft and fresh, and they welcome them. For in every question, there is a spark of what once was. In every echo, the original voice is reborn. Some cities live in the rush of commerce, some in the cries of war. Carol lived in stillness, and in that stillness it taught. It taught that knowledge does not need conquest, that beauty does not require noise, that silence can hold wisdom. The memory of Carol is not a roar. It is the breath before speech, the hush before ritual, the pause before the stars appear. It is stillness remembered. Carol has no king buried in gold, no tale of conquest carved in stone, but she remains, in wind, in shadow, in the memory of peace. She asks nothing of us, only that we listen, only that we remember that once, in a time before empires, a people rose with music and reed, and built a city not of war, but of breath. And the wind, the ancient wind, still sings her name. Before the sun crowned the desert with fire, before the salt winds rushed down from the Andes, there were those who stood in silence, waiting for light to return, waiting for a beam to strike stone at just the right angle. For in Carol, light was not only seen, it was measured, honored, woven into the order of all things. The solar courtyard was not just a sacred place, but a calendar made of earth and shadow. They knew when the sun would slip, when the longest night would fall, when the rains might stir beyond the horizon. These markers, simple to our eyes, were clocks for an eternal cycle, not mechanical but celestial. Here astronomy was a language, not numbers but rhythm, not stars but breath. When the priest lifted his hands and whispered through the wind, he was not praying to the sun, but speaking with it, remembering its promises, reciting the songs it taught the river long before Carol rose from the silt. And when the first light touched the stone, it was as if the earth exhaled. In the bone of the bird, in the hollow of the cane, they carved voices, not words, but music, sounds that drifted like breath from the throat of the desert. These were not mere instruments. They were memory of the heron gliding over riverbanks, of the whisper of wind through the reed beds, of the cries of distant llamas on mountain trails. They sang not for performance, but for alignment, to harmonize the soul with sky. Children learned to blow through the narrow bones, to call to the wind spirits, to learn the scales of silence. It was said that every note played stirred the breath of the ancestors. And when the flutes were played at dusk, when the pyramids were dyed red by the retreating sun, the music didn't rise, it settled. Like smoke, like dust, like prayer without language. What remains today are fragments. Cracked bone, brittle reed, notes that no longer have a tongue. But if you sit among the stones, if you let the wind curl around your ear, you might hear it still. A trembling note from 5,000 years ago, riding the breath of the past. It stood without voice. No hieroglyph, no mural, no boast etched in stone, only silence. And yet it spoke. In its shape, in its geometry, in the echo of the wind as it passed through its terraces. This pyramid, unlike those of kings or conquerors, bore no name. It was built not to glorify a single man, but a people. Vision, a harmony between land and time. Its base was wide as the dreaming earth, its summit modest, not meant to scrape the heavens, but to listen to them. Priests stood at the top, not to rule, but to interpret. Each stone, laid by many hands, fit into the next with the care of breath. Earthquake-proof, aimless, a monument not to war, but to patience. We do not know the name of the architect. We do not know the ceremonies once held inside. But we know this. In its silence, it tells a deeper truth, that greatness does not always shout. Sometimes it simply endures. Among all the symbols that rose from Carol, none whispered louder than the spiral. It was not shouted from walls or blazoned on banners, but tucked quietly into their woven cloth, etched in the dirt of ceremonial paths, traced in the windswept dunes by unseen hands. The spiral was life, turning inward, a return. The woman who wove by the Soup River did not rush. She did not measure time in hours, but in thread and shadow and breath. Her fingers knew what the stars knew, that the universe bends, not in lines but in curves. That time is not a march forward, but a winding, coiling path that leads us back to where we began. The weavers of Carol told stories in warp and weft, not of gods or kings, but of rivers that never stop flowing, of wind that circles the mountain and returns to the sea. Their looms held memory. The spiral was not ornament, it was philosophy, a truth older than stone. And though the cloths have long since turned to dust, the spiral lives on, in galaxies, in shells, and in the breath of dreamers who still seek their way home. They came not with swords, but with salt, not with banners, but with baskets of beans, cords of dried fish, woven blankets scented with river reeds. The traders of Carol moved with grace, not as conquerors, but as connectors. Across desert and mountain, they walked and bartered, offering not dominance, but rhythm, a pulse of exchange that tied one world to another. From the highlands came feathers of the jungle. From the coast, obsidian, spondylus shell, lime for chewing coca leaf. And always the stories. They carried tales in the soles of their feet, messages between valleys, prophecies caught in the curls of smoke from fires shared. These were the lifelines of Carol. No chariots, no iron, just people and trust and time. The trade paths were not lines of conquest, but arteries of peace. When the traders returned, they brought more than goods. They brought the hum of distant songs, the scent of faraway fields. Carol was not isolated. It breathed through others. And that breath echoed across continents, long before empires had names. It was not gold that held Carol together. Not law, not war, but food, and fire, and the joy of eating with others. The feasts of Carol were not lavish in riches, but abundant in warmth. A shared pot of maize and anchovy, handful of beans, a bowl of squash spiced with desert herbs. The bounty of a river that had learned to give because the people had learned to ask it gently. Around these fires they did not divide, they united. The builder sat beside the priest. the fisherman beside the weaver, and the children laughing under stars listened to the old ones tell stories of how the mountains once walked, how the sky and river once fell in love. These were not only meals, they were ceremony. They were the glue of memory. Even now, in the bones of ancient hearths, in the scorch marks still burned into the clay, we feel it, the echo of warmth, the scent of smoke, the murmur of gratitude that once rose with the steam. No trumpet sounded, no battle cry, just the quiet decision to leave. Why? We do not know. The river may have shifted its course. The trade winds may have changed. Perhaps the earth trembled too often. Perhaps the sky gave fewer rains. But there was no burning, no blood. The city was left gently, as if kissed goodbye. Doors unbarred. Fires banked, but not extinguished. Tools placed where they could be found again. As if they would return. As if Carol would wait. And wait it did for 4,000 years. Buried by silence, cradled by the sand. Forgotten by memory but not by time. The wind swept its plazas. The stars passed overhead. Until one day a hand brushed back the dust and found a city still dreaming. Beneath the desert's breath, Carol slept. Not in death but in waiting. Waiting for someone to listen. And when the sands were peeled back, it did not scream, it whispered. Whispered in broken bone flutes, in spiral patterns drawn in earth, in the careful placement of infant bones beside shells. This was not just excavation. It was communion, a dialogue across millennia. And those who heard not only what Carol was, but what we still might become. She stands where they once stood. Eyes wide, ears listening. In her hands the reed flute waits. The wind curls around her, not to chill, but to teach. She is not the first to return. She will not be the last. Carol lives in her breath, in her steps, in the way her fingers rest on the hollow tube like it holds the memory of a people. And maybe it does. They called it the City of Wind, not because it howled, but because it whispered. Not because it destroyed, but because it shaped. Carol, the quiet heart of a continent, a place where peace was architecture, and time moved in circles, not lines, teaches still that a city need not be mighty to be eternal, that legacy is not always carved in stone, sometimes it's carried on the wind. And if you listen, in the hush between sleep and dawn, you may hear it, the breath of a forgotten world. There was no fire, no blood, no sudden end. Carol did not fall like empires do in song, with spears and screaming. No, it faded, like a breath forgotten in still air. People left, quietly, slowly, one by one. Trade paths dried, rivers shifted, and the earth beneath their feet changed its song. Perhaps it was drought, or famine, or something less visible, a spiritual fatigue, a silence too long. But they left behind their walls, their music, their temples, and the shape of their dreams carved into stone. And Carol, the city of harmony, fell asleep under the sand. Even in absence there is presence. The air still holds echoes, the last chord of a flute, the soft chant of a priestess, the laughter of children playing among pyramids. Stones remember, wind remembers, and the ruins do not mourn. They wait, patient as time, silent as breath. They wait for the next to come, not to conquer, but to listen. For 4,000 years, Carol slept beneath the silence, unmarked by war, untouched by legend, forgotten by the page. No chroniclers wrote of it. No libraries preserved its name. And so, it became wind, buried not by destruction but by indifference, until the earth itself whispered the name again, and the hands of the curious uncovered what the sky had once seen. In the late 20th century the dust stirred, and Carol, forgotten mother of cities, opened her eyes once more. Archaeologists, wide-eyed and careful, brushed back time. They uncovered music carved into bone flutes, spiral staircases built before iron, plazas that echoed with ceremonies when Rome was yet unborn. And they stood stunned, not by violence or conquest, but by peace. Peace shaped into pyramid. Harmony turned into architecture. A civilization built not for war, but for wonder. The question was not, how did they build? But why did they build this way? Carol gave no kings, no generals, no walls to keep enemies out, no weapons buried with rulers. Instead, instruments, textiles, offerings of fruit and fish. Their greatness was not in blood, but in balance. They sang to the stars, aligned their temples to the solstice, and marked time by shadow. This was not a city of war. It was a city of wind and spirit and order. They knew nothing of wheels, or metal, or the written word, but they knew gravity. They knew earth and fiber and flow. Reed bags became their trucks, braided ropes their cranes. Their temples stood earthquake strong, balanced with the tremble of the world. It wasn't magic, it was knowledge, ancient and intuitive. They built not with conquest, but with understanding. They did not enslave. They cooperated. Carol was a city not of empire, but of consensus. Among their ruins, archaeologists found music. Not just flutes, but stones that sing when struck. Lithophones, ancient xylophones tuned to the hum of the valley. Did they play them under stars? Did the music guide ceremony, or call the wind? No one knows for sure. But the silence between each note still carries something holy. Carol believed in balance, not dominance. Every temple, every road, every flame was laid with duality in mind. Male and female, dry season and wet, moonrise and firelight. No single force ruled. It was the dance between that gave the city breath. Harmony was not an idea, it was the law. From Carol came many. Cities to the north and south, temples deeper inland, cultures that rose with echoes of her shape. She was the mother of urban life in the Americas. Yet she did not conquer. She inspired. Her legacy was not war banners, but silence, balance, and the blueprint of peace. Carol is not gone. She whispers, in wind, in stone, in the eyes of those who remember. And though her name faded once, now it rises again, not to command but to remind, that a city can thrive without war, that greatness can rise from harmony, and that sometimes the deepest strength lies not in conquest, but in stillness. Beneath the roar of history, before the ink of chronicles and the noise of conquest, there were those who built in silence, not with war horns or blood, but with baskets filled with stone and sun-baked sand. They were the quiet architects. They had no metal, no written language, no wheel to aid them, yet they measured the sky. They summoned symmetry from earth and wind. They laid their temples not with force, but with rhythm. The rhythm of labor passed hand to hand, the rhythm of reed against stone, the song of wind through valley corridors. They did not shout their names across time. They whispered them, trusting the desert to remember. In Carol, even labor hummed in harmony. As they built, they played. Bone flutes carved with care, panpipes tuned to the wind. Their music was not a luxury, it was a language of rhythm and spirit, where the lifting of a stone could match the breath through a reed. These were not idle tunes. They summoned something deeper, a way to keep the heart steady, the hand certain, the mind fixed on more than just the dust. Their sound was soft, but in that softness they wove strength, a strength that built pyramids, a strength that outlasted time. Look closely, you will find no city walls, no towers of watchful defense, no trenches to divide friend from foe. Carol was open, a city that trusted, not because it was naive, but because it had chosen a different path. It did not thrive by conquering neighbors. It thrived by building relationships, by feeding trade routes, by offering music and calendars, knowledge and ritual. In a world that would later be carved up by borders, Carol stood as a breath of peace. City without swords, a civilization without walls. Not less powerful but more profound. Before medicine wore white robes, before healing was catalogued in books and formulas, it was touch, it was song, it was memory passed through hands. In Carol, the healer was not feared but revered, not for power but for understanding. They knew which root soothed fever, which wind cooled anger, which silence was needed for a grieving soul. They did not seek to defeat nature, but to listen to the breath of the earth, the whisper of leaves, the rhythm of blood. Healing, in Carol, was a form of harmony. To mend the body was to retune the instrument. They watched the sky not to dominate it, but to dance with it. Carol's astronomers were not conquerors of the cosmos. They were interpreters. They read the sun's descent, the moon's curve, the hush before an eclipse. They marked the turning of seasons not with alarm, but with invitation, aligning their pyramids to the breath of solstice, their rituals to the rise of Venus. They knew that to plant well, one must look upward, that to understand the valley, one must first understand the heavens. The wind did not speak, but they heard it. What did the children dream of in a city without war? They ran beneath the shadow of pyramids, not fearing them, but playing in their presence. Their games mirrored ritual, their songs mirrored stars, and their laughter echoed against walls not built for defense, but for gathering. They were not prepared for battle, they were prepared for life, for harmony, for the sacred dance between human and earth. And when they looked up they saw not, and so she slept, beneath centuries of wind, cradled in silence, pearl, not forgotten, but dreaming. No walls of war, no cry of empire, only music, prayed, ceremony, and stars. She was not born in conquest. She was not shaped by sword. She rose from rhythm, of reed flute, of footstep, of breath. And now we know, before the pharaohs, before the pyramids, there was a city, shaped by peace. If you loved this poetic journey through the forgotten past, give it a like, subscribe to our channel, and stay with us for more stories where silence speaks and the wind remembers.